Hear the word of the Lord, O people of Israel. The Lord has filed a lawsuit against you, listing the following charges. There's no faithfulness, no kindness, no knowledge of God in your land. You swear and lie and kill and steal and commit adultery. There's violence everywhere, with one murder after another. That is why the land is not producing. It's filled with sadness, and all living things grow sick and die. The animals, the birds, even the fish begin to disappear. Don't point your finger at someone else and try to pass the blame on to him. Look, priest, I'm pointing my finger at you. My people are destroyed because they don't know me. And it's all your fault. You priests, for you yourselves refuse to know me. You have forgotten my laws. The more my people multiplied, the more they sinned against me. They exchanged the glory of God for the grace of idols. The priests rejoice in the sins of the people. They lap it up and lick their lips for more. And this is it. Like priests, like people. Because the priests are wicked, the people are too. Wine, women, and song have robbed my people of their brains, for they're asking a piece of wood to tell them what to do. Divine truth comes to them through tea leaves. The men of Israel finish up their drinking bouts, and off they go to find some whores. Their love for shame is greater than for honor. I have seen your evil deeds, Israel. You have left me as a prostitute leaves her husband. On the king's birthday, the princes get him drunk. He makes a fool out of them and drinks with those who mock him. My people mingle with the heathen, picking up their evil ways. Thus they become as good for nothing as half-baked cakes. They've sown the wind and they've reaped the whirlwind. Oh, Israel, how well I remember those first delightful days when I led you through the wilderness. How refreshing was your love, how satisfying, like the early figs of summer in the first season. And then you deserted me for another god. I don't want your sacrifices. I want your love. I don't want your offerings. I want you to know me. Are you listening, Israel? Oh, pardon me. I didn't realize I had some foreigners in the crowd today. Welcome to Samaria, the fortress city capital of the state of Israel. My name is Hosea. I also have the nicknames Joshua and Jesus because my name means salvation. By the looks of you, you've traveled a long distance. I'm not familiar with this form of dress. Perhaps you come from the far west. Anyway, welcome to the northern kingdom of Israel. Jeroboam II, son of Joash, is our king. So, what do you think of the renovations he's done to this capital city? Do you know that these newer walls are 33 feet thick? But I've been trying to tell those boneheads that doesn't matter how thick the walls are, because God has revealed the future to me, and the Assyrians are going to utterly destroy this place one day anyway. After all, several of the previous kings came to power by assassinating the kings before them. The people around here worship all right. Oh, they worship God, but in the same ceremony, they also worship several other gods that the neighbors introduced them to. So they had this crazy mixture of worship from Moses, and you won't believe this, but prostitution in the temple, no less. And yet, they've stooped even lower than that. They now offer their children as sacrifices to the god of Moloch. Their very own children. They don't seem to care anymore. If you have a child out of wedlock, or if the child is unexpected and inconvenient, well, there's no problem because we can conveniently dispose of them at the altar of Moloch in our religious services. These kinds of things have been going on like this off and on for hundreds of years, you know. Of course, God could have forced them to stop it, but he knows that force will never gain anyone's love. God prefers to operate from the law of love and freedom. He knows that by this method, he will one day win their love. And they will not fear him, but love him. And it will be out of their personal choice to do what's right in the land. By the way, I'm a member of the upper class in Israel. Most of my ancestors made it to the top of society by fraud and murder and deception. I'm ashamed to admit my heritage, but let me warn you, be careful when you go about doing your trading and business in this city. Very rarely will you find an honest merchant here. Some of you are still looking at me quite puzzled, I perceive. Well, I guess that's because you heard most of my daily sermon to the people that go in and out of these city gates. Well, let me tell you my whole story. It's been many years now since God first called me to speak out against the atrocities of our society. At first, I went at it with a vengeance. I had no mercy with these stiffnecks. I gave hellfire sermons, believe me. I spoke the truth. The straight testimony is when I called my messages. You see, God brought to my attention some of the evils that the people were into around here. Even the priests, as you now know. God described Israel as a whore, a prostitute, and an adulteress. So I felt I had the right to just let Israel have it below the belt. I stripped her naked before her enemies. I really shamed her as she rightfully deserved. And all that time, I thought I was doing God a real favor. I thought that all God wanted was to shame Israel to the degree that she deserved to be shamed. I thought by shaming her and disgracing her and having no mercy, no love in my preaching, that one day I would convert her. But God came to me with a strange request. I was a single man back in those days when he came to me with this request. He asked me to get married. Now you might say, well, so what's wrong with God asking a single man to get married? Well, the strange part was that he actually picked out my marriage partner for me. He asked me to marry Gomer, daughter of Diblaim. So you might say, a bit strange perhaps, but was she good looking? Was she a good kisser? As a matter of fact, she was very attractive and a good kisser. But unfortunately, it was from experience because up until then, she had made her living by kissing. You see, she was a woman of the streets, a prostitute. Now I know what you're thinking, that I wasn't hearing the voice of God. I must be having delusions, right? But after hearing the voice of God for so many years, friends, I knew it was the same familiar voice that I was hearing. Hosea, I want you to go find Gomer the prostitute and ask her to marry you. Well, you can bet I begged God, please, God, not Gomer. Anybody but Gomer, God, please. Half the men in Samaria have already slept with her. I mean, she was one of those Baal worshippers. Baal's one of the gods of the fertility cults from the ancient Canaanites. To a Canaanite, going to church and having sex, we're all part of the same experience. God, I'll do anything. God, I'll be a missionary in Africa. I'll do like Ezekiel and lie naked by the city gates. Anything but marry a prostitute. God, have mercy on me. Haven't I been a good prophet, God? What have I done to deserve this? But like I said, God would never force me to do this. And I knew that he must have a very good reason for this strange request, so I just trusted God. Well, I popped the question to Gomer. She laughed in my face when she heard my proposal. I'm sure she must have thought that I was joking, of course. I mean, she probably was used to such trickery and jest. In fact, it took me 3 complete separate attempts to finally persuade her to not only to believe me, but to accept my proposal. As you might have guessed, we were not a good match. I never was sure if she loved me, or just thought that maybe this was her only chance to make a break from her old life. I could never feel like I could trust her. I never knew for sure, for example, if the children she bore after our marriage were mine or someone else's. I eventually came to discover that 2 of the 3 children were someone else's. Yet I just raised them as my own. Gomer's first child was a boy. I was pretty sure he was mine. I mean, Gomer seemed to be playing the part of a faithful wife at the time. But I named him Jezreel. Jezreel means God will sow punishment. I guess you could say I was really rubbing it in that someday these people like Gomer would have to pay for their life of sin. I must have really had a chip in my shoulder back in those days, because when the second child was born, a daughter this time, a child that I knew was not mine but another man's, I named her Lo Ruhama, which means not pitied or loved. Likewise, the third child, who was not mine either, it was a son this time again, and I named him Lo Ami, which means not my people. You might think, what a sick sense of humor, because as you can imagine, word spread not only around our local neighborhood, but the entire country. I mean, after all, every day when I called my kids in for dinner, the neighbors would hear me calling their names. God will sow punishment, not loved or pitied, not my people. It's time for dinner. But as you think my kids have odd names, you should hear what Isaiah, a prophet in the southern kingdom, named his two sons. I can't even pronounce their names, and their meanings were, well, another story. But you know something? As time went on, I eventually really fell in love with Gomer. I mean, she had a smile and a personality that could knock your sandals off. In fact, I began to love her so much, I became extremely jealous if any man even looked her way. I had a full right, according to the laws of Moses, to divorce Gomer after she cheated on me and got pregnant with our second child. But by then, I was so in love with her, I could not bring myself to hate her. Even after she had done these things to me, it just hurt so bad. You know, I think I was beginning to see God in a different way. In spite of her whore-like behavior, God still deeply loved Israel. In fact, it was then that I began to see that I had myself been quite out of balance in my own preaching. I should have been sharing this love of God along with my rebukes. Yes, I loved Gomer so much, it came to the place where I could not be angry with her when she went out at night, leaving me alone with the children. Instead, I would lie there in my bed, waiting for her to return, heartbroken that she did not find her love in me, but seeking love in other men. It tore me apart. I couldn't sleep. I would lay there and listen for the very sound that she might be at the door and returning home. Yes, I had lots of time to lie there and think about why God allowed me to fall in love with this woman. Why, God? Just when I thought she was a reformed woman, my faithful wife, she cheated on me and returned to her whoredom. I loved her so much, God. Why, God? And then it began to dawn on me that God must be feeling the same way about us. When we begin to let our time alone with him, our relationship with him slide because we're too busy with life, when we begin to backslide and find sin more attractive than a relationship with God, if God even loves us a fraction of how much I love Gomer, it must really hurt God when we do these things to his heart. God may have showed me that Israel was like this unfaithful wife and prostitute, but it never dawned on me that he actually was in love with her anyway. And it broke his heart to be treated like that. Night after night, I agonized over my dilemma of what to do with my love for Gomer. I tried everything I could possibly think of to win her love to me. I bought her roses. I bought her candy. I bought her new clothing. I courted her. I begged her. I shed tears over her. I poured out myself to her. I would have given my life for her. That the more I did to show my love for her, the more she seemed to scorn my love. Until one night, I waited awake for so long for her return, I fell asleep. And when I woke up in the morning, I discovered that she had never come home. For a while, I decided that I hated her. Well, I thought that if I hated her, I could stop myself from loving her. And this way I wouldn't have to feel the hurt so much. But it didn't work. No matter how hard I tried to hate her, I still loved her. I couldn't give her up. Well, at first, when I found out where she was living, I tried to persuade her to come home. But in the meantime, I took care of the 3 children as if every one of them was my own. You know what? It wasn't easy being a single father in Israel, let me tell you. The people just laughed at me and scorned me, especially after all I had to say about them, about their evil ways in my preaching. God had still called me to preach, you know. You understand now, and I understood that my preaching took on a new flavor because I could speak from experience and from my understanding of God's grace. So I would find out that Gomer needed food or clothes or anything, and I would find ways to supply her needs. She never knew it was me that provided those things. She might have suspected it, I suppose, but I think she felt that it could never be me because of how she treated me. Well, one day she disappeared completely. I had no idea where she went. Day after day, week after week, month after month, I searched for her. Have you seen my wife, Gomer? The people must have gotten tired of me asking the question. I think what kept me going was that promise that God had given me several years ago. Remember, God doesn't control what happens in the future, but he knows what's going to happen. And so he distinctly told me that one day she would call me Ishi, my husband, instead of Bali, my master. You see, ever since I courted her and on through our marriage, she always called me master, Bali. Never did she call me her husband. I just figured that with time she would be able to shake off her poor self-image, her low self-esteem, and realize that I really loved her and that she would eventually come around. I guess I felt that I had her hand in marriage, but certainly not her heart. She served me well as a wife, but I never sensed any tender heart towards me. And then I began to think about how God must feel when his people just serve him, do all the right things without any heart of love, just only with a sense of obligation and duty, what is right. He must long for his people to fall in love with him, just like he loves us. But Gomer was gone, and I began to beg God every day, help me find her, God, help me find her again. But I seemed to get no response from God except this promise that God made me that one day she would call me Ishi, my husband. And so I kept on. And then one day, I was passing through the marketplace when all of a sudden I looked and I couldn't believe my eyes. There on the slave auction block was my Gomer, looking so skinny and beat up, and her clothes were in tatters. I hardly recognized her there. She was being sold as a slave, and the present law stated that if someone bought her, they would have the right to do anything with her as a slave. They could even kill her. My heart was absolutely wrenched out of my chest over the situation. My first thought was, what if it happened that I had not been passing through the market today at this precise moment? Immediately, I sized up the situation. The bidding was about to begin, so I began to make mental calculations of the costs that I knew I would be willing to sell everything I owned and even sell myself if I had to in order to buy her back. I won that auction. I took her home that day with me from that auction block. I knew I had to do something out of the ordinary to win her love, or she would just serve me like a slave and feel that I might kill her if she left home again. So I decided that I would take her to the desert. We found a place for the children to stay, and I took her to this beautiful oasis in the desert. It's called Palm Springs, and there's this really nice inn there. I think it's called the Sandman Inn. Oh, I see you're familiar with this place. Well, this way we could be alone together, just the two of us. No kids, no preaching at the gates of the city, nothing for a long while. There we stayed in the desert, in the wilderness, just the two of us. And I decided that I would be her lover there in the wilderness, just as if she were the purest of virgins, and I would not hold back any part of my love for her. It would be like a courtship, a marriage, and a honeymoon all over again. I would woo her off her feet until she felt absolutely certain of my love for her. And you know, it worked. Since I have brought her home now, she's been my loving wife. She's full of tenderness towards me now, and she now calls me Ishi, my husband, just like God promised. God might seem really slow at bringing about his promises, but they will be fulfilled. When they're finally realized, his promises will be even sweeter than we have anticipated them to be. So now, I do have a new perspective on God's unconditional love for his people. And now my preaching has changed. I preach the good news of God's grace and mercy and love for us. And now I speak for God out of my own experience. Oh, so will you excuse me? Thank you for visiting our fair city. I really should get back and finish my sermon this morning. Oh, here, God sends this message to Israel. I will court her again and bring her into the wilderness and speak to her tenderly there. There I will give back her vineyards to her and transform her valley of troubles into a door of hope. She will respond to me there, singing with joy in days long ago in her youth, after I freed her from captivity in Egypt. In the coming days, says the Lord, she will call me my husband instead of my master. O Israel, I will cause you to forget your idols, and their names will be spoken no more. At that time, I will make a treaty between you and the wild animals, birds, and snakes, not to fear each other anymore. I will destroy all weapons, and all wars will end. Then you will lie down in peace and safety, unafraid, and I will bind you to me forever with chains of righteousness and justice, love and mercy. I will betroth you there to me in faithfulness and love, and you will really know me then as you never have before. In that day, says the Lord, I will answer the pleading of the sky for clouds to pour down water on the earth in answer to its cry for rain. The earth can answer the parched cry of the grain, the grapes and the olive trees for moisture and for dew, and the whole grand chorus shall sing together, God sows, he has given all. At that time I will sow a crop of Israelites and raise them for myself. I will pity and love those who are not pitied and loved. I will say to those who are not my people, now you are my people. And they will reply, you are our God.